Well, the wedding bells are ringing, and Valerie wants that perfect wedding gift. You know, those two are a couple of cut-ups. I think I've got just the perfect thing in mind for them. Come on into the shop. Let me show you what we're building. Well, in this episode, we're going to make a cutting board for those newlyweds. That way, on day one, they can start cooking. Kitchen stuff. 3D cutting board, part 1. We want this cutting board to develop a sense of depth. And you can take maple and you can cut a uniform shape, stack it up against each other, and it's a beautiful cutting board. Truly it is. But if you want to develop shape and a 3D optical illusion, you really do need to introduce 2 additional species of wood, at least 2. Now I've got some cherry over here and some walnut over there. And if you take those and orient them such, you can develop what looks like a 3D box. When you put the whole field together, it just jumps right out at you. If you come back and take some more maple and you put that edge around it, then it looks like you've got a 3D box with a solid edge all around it. That's what we're going to do. It's going to be beautiful. Now, what we need to do is cut this into strips about, 18 inches long. And from those strips, we're going to cut out sections. Now, getting all that to glue up and getting good uniform glue pressure is difficult. For that, we need a jig. My first thought was, I need gravity to work with me on this. This is going to be a difficult glue up under the best of circumstances. So I put together a couple of pieces of plywood, and I envision my pieces, composites, going into this and letting gravity try to hold this together initially while I get some clamps on it. And this is a great idea. And my first thought, let's use some packing tape, and we'll put the packing tape on either side, and that way the glue won't stick. But you know something? I have an old cutting board right here, and that can go in right there and right here, and the glue won't stick to that at all. So I think that's my going in position. So we're going to set up a series of supports right here, alternating on either side, so that we can get a clamp here and a clamp here all along this length. I'll take some scrap and cut a 45-degree angle on it, and then I'll get the length right at the table saw. We'll take 2 of the legs and clamp them together with a set of parallel clamps. Drop a bead of glue on and then put our rack in place. A 1 3/4 inch brad holds it in place while the glue dries. But, I'll follow that up with a screw. Well, I'll take the easy way out here. We're just going to do 3 legs. That other side comes off. The thing about a 3-legged stool, it never wobbles. When I cut these on the table saw, they left a burr. I don't need a burr. As a matter of fact, a rounded edge is preferable on all these things. And if you do cut this plastic material, be aware of that. First of all, like wood, it's not going to be perfectly straight. So we're going to have to secure this with several screws. But get rid of that edge. It'll do nothing but cause problems. I've pre-drilled the plastic, and I'm securing these with some 3/4 inch screws. No need for glue. It won't stick. Well, I've got my jig far enough along that I think I can use it to test out some things, but we can't test anything out until we mill up some lumber. Let's start with that maple. We want to get that 7/8 by 7/8 core. If you're milling up lumber, everything starts with the jointer. We need a flat face to start with. After we get that flat face, then we can go ahead and put it up against the fence, which is set at 90 degrees. That will square up the corner and give us something to work with at the table saw. It's time to cut some sticks, and we don't have to get close on this. All I want to do is get a rough dimensions, so we're set at 1 inch, and we'll cut these things to width. Well, we've roughed them out, but recall we've got 2 flat faces and 1 square corner. Let's mark the roughed out edges and get ready for the next step. That next step is the planer, and since we're close, it'll only take 1 pass. The real trick is to make sure you can see your mark. Well, we're 7/8 right at it, and that's fine. Everything's square. we're in good shape. It's time for the next step. We need to focus on the cherry and the walnut. Remember, that's the next layer. And according to the paper, it's a 1/2 inch thick. And we'll get there. That's not the issue that I'm at all concerned about. I'm concerned about the length. On paper, that's 1 1/8. But what we have to do is make sure when we put a square edge up against this, that miter right there, the beginning of it, has to line up with this edge. Otherwise, when we put pressure on this on the glue up, that mitered edge won't squeeze together and won't get tight. This is a very critical joint. So when it comes time to make that one, we're really going to pay attention to it. Well, I've got my cherry over here on my compound miter saw, and we're getting ready to cut it to rough lengths, roughly about 18 inches. That's what the core stock for the maple turned out to be. Now, we're going to be milling this stock in conjunction with our walnut, and they have to be absolutely the same thickness. That's going to be the focus. We're going to cut them into strips, roughly 1.5 inches. That gives us a lot of leeway. Now, the thickness is supposed to be a 1/2 inch. That'll be a lot of shavings. We'll see what I can tolerate. Make your marks. Doesn't take much time, but it saves material. And when you start paying for cherry and walnut, you'll understand. Maple's a little cheaper, but boy, I tell you what, I don't want to waste any of this stock. Our pieces are small, so we won't start with face planing, not on a board this wide. But we will get that square edge. I don't want to go to the table saw fence with something that's a little wonky. We'll rough out the width on the table saw, and in hindsight, I should have used the bandsaw. I don't need a precision cut here, and it would have been safer and probably quicker to do it on the bandsaw. Well, we're roughed out. It's time for marks, and we're going to mark all 4 sides. Here's a trick. When you're working with wider boards, mark both sides of the edge. That'll ensure when you joint it, or if you clean it up on the table saw, you get both sides. If it's really out of 90 and you're just taking off a whisper, you might not square up the whole face. The next step is to get a flat face at the jointer, and this is where our marks really help us. They tell us when we're done and not to go too much farther, and that saves us a lot of time. We have a flat face, and now we can get a parallel one. That happens at the planer. And again, you can see how the marks are telling us when we're done. Now that we're at thickness, we'll just go ahead and clean up that edge. I do want a square, straight edge. That'll help me index for the glue up. Well, I've got my walnut and my cherry, and this is my maple core. The color contrast on this is quite dramatic. I think this is going to be real pretty when it's assembled. Now, I'm standing behind my drop table. This is the drop from a previous project. It's not done yet, so I'm going to hold on to this until I finish. In that project, we did have a mistake. We cut some drawer panels a little too short, and there they sit. And I'm looking at those for the surround. Remember, we have 2 more pieces of maple that stack up on the outsides of these, one here and one there. And then we cut the 45s accordingly. I could try to use this material right here, but to be truthful, I think the time involved and the amount of material that I could salvage is too low. So my thought process is, let's go resalvage the mistake and make use of it. Now, you've seen me mill up this material, so I'm not going to go there. But let's take a look at why I want to put this aside for the moment and mill up the maple. It'll become obvious in a second. Well, all my maple is milled up, and I have placed it in the clamps and gotten things arranged primarily to make things go smoother. This is what I want to glue up. Now, what am I going to do? I am going to put 1 coat evenly with this roller onto the maple and sandwich it up, and then I'm going to put it back in the clamps. And we're going to do that, repeat that process as we go. This back here is a cull that is really only to help distribute the load from the clamps a lot more evenly. There are 2 more clamps that go here and here. This isn't it. I want good uniform pressure across this whole thing. Now, the glue I've got here has a little bit more open time, and that's important because I've got a lot of surfaces to do. Once I start, I'm not stopping. So I'm going to move this stuff out of the way, and I'll talk over anything that is of importance as we go.
This looks like a lot of glue, but keep in mind I've got to do two things. First thing is I've got to saturate the roller. Unless the roller is evenly coated and thick with glue, it's not going to distribute it very well. And you would be shocked at how much glue goes in to painting these surfaces. I'm only painting one side. The other side has to take the glue from the previous one. So saturate your brush first and saturate it well. Otherwise, you'll be fighting the process. I just thought I thought of everything. Well, it doesn't take much. A little bit of glue splatter will cause you to go jump and get some paper towels for cleanup. You really don't want any glue to bridge the gap between your sandwiches. Otherwise, you'll be fighting that as you go. So have some paper towels there to clean up your mess when you make one. Once you get into a rhythm, it starts to go a little faster.
These turned out great, and my biggest fear was not realized. They didn't stick together, and that is really, really good. If you're a little careful with this glue, you can achieve the same results. Now, the next step, we need to take a scraper, knock some of this squeeze out off, and then get a perfectly square edge on one side. We'll go to the geometer to do that. We're setting up for the most critical cut in the project. If we don't get this 45-degree angle right, it's going to show up in every one of these little sections, and I can't have that. So I've taken a lot of time initially. I've adjusted my throat plate right here. I've made sure that it is level with the cast iron and solidly embedded. I have tested my blade right there as best I can. My digital measure has gone missing, and I don't know where it is. So I've taken a lot of time to try to adjust that as best I can. Finally, all of that measurement makes no difference whatsoever if the piece isn't firm against the table saw. So I have my roll down holder right here, only one of them. And it is actually, I've taken a sacrificial fence and cut a notch out because there wasn't enough clearance here for the blade. So all these precautions have been taken in order to get the perfect cut. It's also got to be safe. So when I use this push stick, I can get about this far and then I stop, which means I sacrifice about 3 inches of material as it rolls around in the blade. I can get a little farther with this one, but still I've got these backside pieces right here that are burnishing, and that will ruin a cut too. I've been experimenting with this, and I can push it all the way through. I don't like it, but quite frankly, I don't see much danger in it because it cannot come back up and hit me, and all it'll do here is just rattle around a little bit. So I'm going to continue to experiment with this. If I can think of another method between here and the end of that, I'll do it. Now, we've got some sample pieces here. I've got some plywood, which is roughly the same thickness as our stock over here. We have it glued up in the clamps. Come on over, let me show you what we've got going on. Well, this is one of my second or third passes, and I keep getting a little bit closer. When you look up here, this right here, that is working very well. Unfortunately, as I move down, I start to get a little bit of a drift. And when I look over here, I could probably get a very small micrometer shim in between the crack over here, and that's not what I want. If this were furniture, I wouldn't have an issue with it at all. This is actually a pretty good joint, and I could squeeze it a little bit harder. Additionally, rarely would I ever put a 45-degree angle cut like this for anybody to look at. And if I did, I would close it up a little bit because the inside you won't see. But on this one, everything is shown. So we've got drift, and we start to open up a little bit from here to here. And the reason isn't the 45-degree angle. The reason is the thickness of the piece. I think we've got a little bit of drift as we move through the blade. And this much drift, to be truthful, I'm actually pretty pleased about. It's very small. The problem is it's visible, and I'm trying to just get rid of all of that. We're going to take it and make these pieces just a touch bigger and do another test cut. Now, a couple of things here. One, I can put additional clamps on top here to help close this in. Yes, I can get additional clamps in here. Second, the glue is going to fill some of these gaps. Third, plywood doesn't slide on itself. These plywood edges where I've got the miter, they're as tough as sandpaper and they grip. When I cut on my wood pieces, that wood is going to slip and slide a whole lot differently than what I've got here. And lastly, wood swells. So in this cut, if I were to put glue in there, the moisture content in the glue is going to cause all those wood fibers to swell. I would almost bet money you would never see that edge after the glue dried. So with all that, I'm still going to do a little bit of what I call the rip fence dance. And we're going to do a couple more samples and see if we can get a little bit closer and a lot tighter.
Well, prep is everything, and I think we're ready. We're going to go ahead and start cutting up these pieces. We're going to start with the cherry, then move on to the maple. We'll start with the core, and the objective here is to get glue on two sides and to try to keep it off the other two sides. We'll take our walnut maple sandwich and we'll apply glue to the 45-degree edge. Once we have a good coat, we'll put it in the jig. This is where gravity starts to work for you instead of against you. The cherry maple sandwich is next, and I can't resist putting a little bit extra glue on there. We don't need it, all sides are coated. Once in the jig and with a little bit of finger pressure, I start to see the squeeze out in the top, and that's expected. But I don't want it on the clamps when I put them in place. We'll go ahead and clean up some of that. Well, at this point in the process, it's all over but the clamping. And because I can't resist, a woodworker never has enough clamps. So keep that in mind. You do want good even pressure. Minimum, and I mean minimum time in the clamps is 2 hours. 2 hours later, and the last clamp is removed. Now comes the hard part. How on earth are we going to get this thing out of the jig? When push comes to shove, use a hammer. In this case, a big screwdriver. In all honesty, it did not take a lot of force to pop this out of the jig. I was really quite pleased. And that's fortunate because the glue has only had 2 hours to set, and that's not a lot of time. We'll put this piece aside for 24 hours before we start working it. We'll clean up our jig and start another glue up. Well, I know I said I'd leave it alone, but I really gotta know what it looks like. So we'll lop off the ends and leave it at that. I think it came out okay. 10 more to go.
Well, these came out pretty good, no complaints. And looking at them, I don't see a whole lot of milling to do. We don't want to do much milling. We want to keep as much of this material as possible. But we do have to clean up this edge. There's too much glue. There are too many imperfections. We are going to very lightly pass this through the jointer to get a perfectly flat edge. Then we're going to come to this side and we're going to square it up. Now, at that point, we're going to go straight over to the planer and get this side and this side parallel. That'll make this square, but again, as little material as possible. We're going to be watching this very closely. Now, it's not just a matter of a little as possible on this piece, it's all of them. That's why all of these have to be squared up, and then they all have to go to the planer because they all need to be the same size. When we start cutting these up into pucks and put them together, they need to match up. Errors in this respect are cumulative. We really need to be precise. So now that you know the game plan, let's get started.
You've heard me say it before, and I'll say it again. Make your marks. In this case, we have to make them on all 4 sides. We really have to watch this pretty close if we're going to keep everything as tight and square as possible. Now, I'm going to gang mark these, and that's perfectly acceptable as long as you know where you've been. It'll also tell you how far you're out by how much the pencil skips. With all sides marked, we'll joint one face flat. It really doesn't matter which one. Getting a square edge on a board this shallow is very difficult, simply because you don't have a whole lot of room to push and force it up to the fence and keep your fingers clear of the blade. Ordinarily I'd use my hands, but it's just way too close to the blade to take that chance. So I'm using my push blocks, and they are not as accurate. Additionally, that's a lot of blade exposed, and the reason is that my blade cover is constantly bumping into the push blocks and causing problems. My solution was to put another blade guard in place, and I think it works pretty well. It covers up about 60% of the blade and allows me to push the piece through without bumping into the existing blade guard. If you have to disable a safety device, review the situation carefully and mitigate your risks appropriately.
Well, we have jointed this edge, and they are square. So at this point, it's time to go to the planer in order to take this face, make it parallel, and this face, and make it parallel. And then all this right angle will migrate around the whole piece, and we'll have a square piece right here. Now, I don't want to take off too much of this material on top or bottom. One, I want to get as big a board as possible. And two, I need to make sure that we maintain this same ratio of thickness on this side versus this side. So we're going to approach this very, very slowly. I have 2 sample sticks right here that I'm going to use to help me set the planer at the right height. And we are going to run these through very, very shallow cuts, just like we did on the jointer.
We're taking this slow, and it's going to be a long process. We have to get as thin as the thinnest board. All of them have to be the same size. Now, we are looking at this. When we push one side through, we'll turn it 90 degrees and get the other side. You have to keep track of this stuff very carefully.
I think we're looking pretty good here. My assembly has come off. I have not removed much material, and everything is good and square. However we decide to glue this up, it should come out without any difficulties whatsoever. Now, I do have a little bleed through on the miter in places, and I don't think that's going to make any difference once we get this glued up. I just don't think anybody's going to see it. So we'll go ahead and leave that for now. Speaking of assembly, we've got 2 ways that we can do this. We can take this log and marry it up in a field of 4, 8, or 12 to make a slab. Then we can cut the slab across, take the pieces and turn them, and make another slab. That's 2 slabs. That's 2 sets of glue ups. That's 2 days. That's a lot of time. And we are limited by every piece being this long. We don't have as much flexibility as I would like. Now, we've taken all the time to get these things uniform thickness, uniform square. We're going to take these and cut them into pucks. Now, these pucks will be about 1.5 inches tall, and when we glue them together, we will press this way, and we will make sure that they adhere firmly to the bed. Now, to do that, we need a jig, and that's what we're working on now. Well, we're about halfway done, and we're going to split this episode into 2 parts. There's plenty of interest left to go. We have assembly, we have more routing to do as far as the handholds to pick up this cutting board. Rounded over edges are another deal, and feet and finish need to go on. Now that assembly jig, that's unique. I did not discover that until last year, and I'm going to show you how to build one from stem to stern. So give me a like, subscribe, and I hope to see you next time in Roby's workshop.